أهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام إلى هذه الحلقة الجديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه ملفاتنا. أسعار خامات نفط السعودية والمنطقة تتفوق على نظيرتها في أمريكا وأوروبا، فما الأسباب؟ وزير الطاقة القبرصي يكشف لمستقبل الطاقة عن تفاصيل اتفاقية تصدير الغاز إلى مصر. مفارقة غير معتادة تشهدها أسواق النفط هذه الأيام، ففيما تشهد الأسعار عموما مرحلة من الضعف النسبي، تسجل أسعار النفط في السعودية والمنطقة عموما ارتفاعات ملحوظة، خصوصا في أسعار البيع إلى آسيا. فقد قامت أرامكو السعودية برفع سعر خامها الرئيسي لأسواق آسيا لشهر مارس بأعلى قدر منذ أكثر من عامين، بفارق $2.40 في العلاوة السعرية عن الشهر الجاري. ولتوضيح الصورة، يتم تسعير خام أرامكو بعلاوة سعرية على معدل سعري خام دبي وخام عمان. هذه العلاوة كانت $1.50 في فبراير، وقد تم رفعها إلى $3.90 لمبيعات شهر مارس، علما بأن خام دبي وخام عمان يتفوقان سعريا في الوقت الراهن على مزيج برنت. في حين زادت العراق العلاوة السعرية لخام البصرة المتوسط بأكبر مقدار منذ شهر فبراير من عام 2021 على الأقل. فما سبب ارتفاع سعر نفط منطقتنا؟ القصة أن هناك انقساما في السوق ما بين تسعير النفط الخفيف الذي يتم إنتاجه في أوروبا وأمريكا، والنفط الثقيل والمتوسط الذي يتم إنتاجه في المنطقة بسبب عوامل متعددة. النفط الخفيف والقليل الكبريت الذي يعتبر المرجع لعقود خام برنت وغرب تكساس المستقبلية يواجه ضعفا موسميا في الطلب هذه الأيام، وأحد الأسباب دخول مصافي النفط في أوروبا والولايات المتحدة في فترة الصيانة السنوية، ما يؤدي إلى انخفاض الطلب. ويتزامن ذلك مع دخول معروض جديد إلى السوق مع الانتهاء من توسعة أحد حقول النفط في كازاخستان، وتوقع دخول كميات إضافية من توسعة حقل آخر في النرويج، وهو ما يؤدي إلى فائض من شحنات النفط الخفيف في السوق. في المقابل تتمتع إمدادات الخام الثقيلة والمتوسطة بطلب قوي في السوق، فهذه الأنواع التي تكون أكثر كثافة وتحتوي على مستويات أعلى من الكبريت تمنح منتجيها فرصة فريدة لزيادة الأسعار. وما يعزز أسعار الخامات الثقيلة والمتوسطة قرارات أوبك بلس المتتالية بتأخير موعد زيادة الإنتاج، ما يحد من تدفق كميات إضافية من نفط المنطقة في الأسواق. كما أن عاملا إضافيا دخل أخيرا، وهو إعلان وزير الخزانة الأمريكي سكوت بيسنت بأن إدارة ترامب ستعمل على خفض صادرات النفط الإيراني إلى 100,000 برميل يوميا، قد يعني في حال تنفيذ التهديد مزيدا من شح الإمدادات من هذا النوع من الخامات. يبدو أن عملية تحول الطاقة عالميا متخلفة اليوم عن مسار تحقيق مستهدفات صافي صفر بحلول عام 2050 التي حددتها اتفاقية باريس للمناخ، وقد بدأ العالم يحيد عن هذا المسار حتى قبل وصول ترامب إلى البيت الأبيض مطلع هذا العام، والذي يعزز وصوله اليوم احتمالية بلوغ ارتفاع درجة حرارة العالم 3 درجات مئوية بحسب سيناريوهات بدأت عدة مؤسسات بطرحها، من بينها مؤسسة استشارات الطاقة وود ماكنزي. هذا السياق قابلت مالكوم فوربس كيبل نائب رئيس استشارات الطاقة في وود ماكنزي، والذي ناقشت معه تبعات تحول الطاقة على كلفة وأمن الطاقة في أوروبا تحديدا، في ضوء الدفعة القوية في هذا الاتجاه التي تقوم بها أوروبا خلال السنوات الأخيرة. لكننا بدأنا اللقاء في استعراض سيناريوهات تحول الطاقة العالمي المختلفة التي تتوقعها المؤسسة. لنتابع.
You pose a really interesting question at a fascinating time in global geopolitics, and particularly around energy and around climate. And, at Wood Mackenzie, we've been well aware of the challenges of delivering the energy transition, over the last decade or so. And what we've had to create are different scenarios to manage the uncertainty around that. Now, we have a scenario that talks about the 1.5 degree, the net zero case, but this is looking, increasingly unlikely. Then our second scenario is the commitments, what we call country pledges. And this is where countries have made commitments to reduce emissions. Although this is a 2-degree pathway, and we just don't feel that we're on that at the moment. So our base case is really around a 2.5-degree warming pathway. And that's what we've held, a view we've held for some time. However, I have to say in the current environment and what we're slowly seeing or quickly beginning to realize in terms of adoption, in terms of targets being missed, is what we call a delayed energy transition. And this is because there's an increasing risk that this is going to happen. And this is the 3-degree case that you're talking about, Nasser.
Moving on, in a recent paper, you argue that Europe's decarbonization push poses a number of risks to its energy security, along other implications. Let us break down this argument piece by piece and start with Europe's decarbonization of its power markets. Big strides have been achieved in that area in increasing the share of renewables in recent years. How is this playing out with regards to security of supply for Europe?
Yeah, okay, this is a fascinating area, and you'll hear all sorts of different views on it. But let me just set a bit of context here, because sometimes it's very hard to understand, where this is coming from, what the ambition is. But if you just think where Europe has been in terms of energy markets over the last, say, 5-6 years, we had COVID, we saw a dramatic increase in energy demand, and we saw a collapse in gas prices. So we had some of the lowest gas prices we'd ever seen. We then saw Russia invade Ukraine in 2022, and that, of course, saw gas prices rocket. So we've seen the highest and the lowest gas prices. So on the back of that, Europe redoubled its efforts to move away from a hydrocarbon-based economy and really start to focus on renewables. And arguably, Europe has been successful here. Indeed, by 2030, Wood Mackenzie forecast that Europe's power supply will be 67% supplied by renewables. This is a pretty impressive transformation, and indeed pretty close to the 69% target that Europe has set. So in terms of that security, we do see increased security in Europe, but there's still a question about that oil and gas supply, heavily dependent on imports.
Exactly, because despite the policies pursued by Europe in the last few years, actual European oil and gas demand have not dropped as much as has been hoped. Why is that?
Yeah, this is a curious case, and I think it's a curious case of hydrocarbons and how hydrocarbons are very difficult to shift away from, and I think we're going to see this globally. But if we think about it and think between 2000 and today, we've seen a 25% drop in demand for oil. So Europe is one of those areas where we continue to see declining demand for oil. Gas has been a bit more stubborn. Gas has got a high usage across Europe, particularly in the power sector, particularly in the domestic sector and the chemical sector. And so that's been a bit more sticky. But as we see rapid penetration in the power sector and we see increasing uptake of EVs across Europe, we do expect a 50% drop in demand for oil by 2050 and more than 60% drop in demand for gas. So things are happening, things are shifting, and by our forecast, we definitely see more happening in this space.
نتوقف الآن مع فاصل قصير مشاهدينا، نتابع بعده في مستقبل الطاقة. في ظل قناعة واسعة اليوم بأن عملية تحول الطاقة لن تكون سلسة، مطالبات بزيادة استثمارات المنبع في النفط والغاز من 500 مليار إلى 650 مليار دولار سنوياً. أهلا بكم من جديد. في متابعة للقائنا مع نائب رئيس استشارات الطاقة في وود ماكنزي مالكوم فوربس كيبل، ناقشنا ورقة بحثية أصدرتها المؤسسة مؤخرا أشارت فيها إلى أن تقييد بريطانيا لاستثمارات تعزيز استخلاص مواردها من النفط والغاز في بحر الشمال من أجل أهدافها المناخية قد فاقم من ارتفاع كلفة الطاقة في البلاد، وعلى عكس ما هو مأمول رفع من صافي انبعاثات بريطانيا بسبب اضطرارها إلى استيراد النفط والغاز لسد احتياجاتها، حيث سألته عن الأسباب التي أدت إلى تراجع الاستثمارات البريطانية في بحر الشمال.
How long have you got, NASA? I could talk about this for a very long time. There's many factors that need to be considered when talking about the UK, and this is the UK, so UK offshore energy sector. But we seem to have ended up in the UK in a curious position. We're not developing domestic resources, but this is due to a combination of factors. And so if we think about, some of the factors that we've seen accumulate over the last year or two, one is an increase in tax terms. So it's now the marginal rate of tax is 78%. You've also seen a reduction in allowances. So the CapEx expenditure you spend, how much you can offset against your taxes. But we've also seen a logjam in the regulatory approval within the court system. And this all pivots around a slightly sort of complicated case, but essentially it's around Scope 3 emissions. So Scope 3 emissions being the emissions created from burning oil and gas. But I look at this and I feel that the UK is at this point where it's not investing. We see a lot of money sitting on the sidelines. We see companies moving out of the North Sea. But curiously, we also see a net emissions increasing because we're increasingly reliant on imports. And I don't think this is where anybody wanted to get to. So I hope there's a reversion to the mean in terms of, pickup of activity and a return to exploiting domestic resources that support jobs, that develop the economy, and also supply all-important security of supply. So I think we're going to see changes here over the coming months and years.
But Malcolm, how does the current UK government direction in foregoing the remaining potential in the North Sea affect the UK energy costs and security?
Yeah, so again, these are all complicated issues, but I think if we just think of the cost side of it now, so just take that first. From a cost perspective, you can, we're part of an integrated international energy market. So in terms of sort of affecting oil and gas prices, we're not really, it's at the margins. So I don't think it's really a question about sort of trying to control costs of commodities. Where we do see an increase in costs, and everybody recognizes this, is through the subsidies that are provided for the low carbon investments. And these are long-term strategic investments that I think the country, the population is largely behind. But this ends up adding to people's electricity bills to subsidize the offshore renewables, the solar, the carbon capture and storage. And if we think about this in terms of that security point, now, if you asked me 5 years ago, I'd have probably given you a pretty bland answer and say, well, UK is part of an international, energy system, and we're well supplied internationally and domestically. But we've seen domestic supply really decline. And at a time when there's, very febrile, very sort of geopolitically tense atmosphere, things can happen. Now, we only need to look at something like Nord Stream, what we saw with the pipelines there, to understand what sort of things could happen in a UK context, what might happen to some of these international pipelines. And that really brings into focus energy security and the UK's energy security and exploiting domestic resources.
So, Malcolm, what lessons should other mature oil and gas producing countries learn from this ongoing debate in the UK currently?
Yeah, there's probably books to be written, and I'm sure there will be books to be written about this. But I think countries need to, think very carefully when they're making sort of strategic decisions about their energy mix, and particularly about existing sectors. I think they need to think really long term. And I always say, use data, not emotion, and use science and not sentiment. and make clear decisions that are science-based, because it's very easy to go down a path where you think you're pursuing the right strategy, whereas in fact, you may come up short. So I think countries need to think very carefully about what they're doing, and also understand the complexities of the energy system, and understand that we're not going from one system and seamlessly shifting to another. What's happening is a diversification, increasingly integrated energy system. And we will continue to need oil and gas, hopefully less for the burning, but more for the petrochemicals, more for all of the useful things that oil and gas provide us, in society.
Yeah. Well, in the background there, Malcolm, today there seems to be a more widely accepted reality that oil and gas will be around for much longer than what many expected just maybe 3 years ago, if not less. Banks have been withdrawing en masse from the net zero financial alliances. European IOCs are gearing back towards hydrocarbons and are abandoning some of their lofty targets in renewables and power. What does this mean for their upstream capex and production levels in the coming years? Is it higher capex, more exploration, or simply maximizing current assets?
Okay, well, it's an interesting question, and perhaps I'm going to give you a boring answer to it, because I would say I think we're going to see all three of these, honestly, because we've been doing some of my colleagues have been doing some research recently and looking at this delayed energy transition, and what does it actually mean, a delayed energy transition, and how much more hydrocarbons will we require if we go down that path? And in terms of oil, they suggest about a 6% increase in what we're currently producing. Then in terms of gas, 3%. Now, if you accumulate that over, out to 2050, these are considerable sums. And what that is in effect saying to us is we're going to need to invest more heavily in the upstream sector. Now, this is in the order of 30%. So currently we're at about 500 billion annually. So this is sort of shifting it up into the sort of 650 territory, $650 billion territory. Now, if you're doing that and you're investing in, new developments, you're very much going to be looking after old developments, so the existing fields, and making sure you maintain production there. And then if I think about the exploration side, well, I just need to talk to my colleagues in the exploration team, and they can assure me that the operators are reloading their exploration portfolios and, setting themselves to find the volumes that we're going to need in the future.
Finally, Malcolm, European officials are debating now whether Russian pipeline gas sales to the EU should be restarted as part of a potential settlement to end the war in Ukraine. How plausible is this return of Russian gas, and how will it impact Europe's transition plans?
And I've seen there's been quite a lot in the press recently about this, and obviously we've got discussions going on today in Saudi Arabia between Russia and America. Now, what comes of those, and how aligned Europe and indeed Ukraine are with the outcome of those discussions, that remains to be seen. But let's just sort of step back a second and think, hang on, Russia was supplying Europe with about 50% of its gas prior to the Ukraine war. We're never going back to that. That's simply just not going to happen. But what I will not rule out is Russian gas coming back into Europe. We already have Russian LNG coming in. It's the pipeline gas that's all but dried up. But if you're a student of energy history, I think you'll know that energy has a curious way of finding its way around geopolitical barriers. So I do suspect in the future that Russian volumes will come back into Europe, but the quantity of that remains to be seen, and the timing of that, well, let's just wait and see.
وقعت مصر وقبرص أول اتفاقيتين لبدء تنمية الاكتشافات القبرصية للغاز الطبيعي باستخدام البنية التحتية المصرية، ومن المقرر أن تستقبل مصر الغاز المنتج من اكتشافات قبرص في شرق المتوسط وتوجيهه إلى السوق المحلي أو إعادة تصديره، ويأتي ذلك ضمن مستهدفات مصر للتحول إلى مركز إقليمي لتجارة وتداول الغاز الطبيعي. وكانت الزميلة ففيما زايد قد أجرت لقاء مع وزير الطاقة والتجارة والصناعة القبرصي جورج باناستاسيو خلال تواجده في القاهرة، حيث قام الوزير بشرح تفاصيل الاتفاقيتين الموقعتين بين قبرص ومصر في هذا الشأن. لنتابع.
We signed two agreements. The first one, which is for Block 6 of in the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus, it's more the host government agreement. It relates, how you commercialize the products that they are coming out from Block 6, natural gas, of course. And you understand that in that agreement there are details which they explain the way that the product will be transported. Natural gas will be transported to the destination. The destination is Egypt, as we said. And from there on, there are details how you commercialize the project, either via taking the project, the natural gas to liquefaction, in order to be exported to markets, to the international market as liquefied natural gas, or they can be diverted to the domestic market. And there are, let's say, there is specific information speaking about prices and ownership of the product, and all the details that the commercial agreement will include.
لكن هل هناك تفاصيل حول الكميات وموعد دخول الاتفاق حيز التنفيذ؟
Yes, the quantities, they very much depend on the recoverability of natural gas coming out from the wells, from the discoveries. You understand that technology will decide how much of the product will be able to come out from the discovery. Certainly, the Republic of Cyprus is looking for as much as possible of the quantity to be put in the markets. And because we spoke about two agreements today, the first one is the host government agreement. The other one is about another discovery, which is a little bit more risk, the Aphrodite discovery, which relates to a different way of transporting the product to Egypt. And possibly this one will, the majority or the highest percentage of that will find its way to the domestic market of Egypt.
هل خط الأنابيب بين مصر وقبرص جاهز لتنفيذ الاتفاق؟
No. For the Block 6 and for the Kronos discovery, it will be a tieback. Tieback means that the discovery will be connected to existing facilities of Zohr, and which they are only 70 kilometers away from Kronos. So the natural gas will be tied back into these existing facilities, and then from there they will be developed. In the infrastructure which exists from Zohr, the product will be taken to Damietta, most of it.
وما تطورات الإنتاج في حقل أفروديت؟
Yes, that's the other agreement that we signed, which is an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding. It's between the two states, the Republic of Cyprus and the Arab Republic of Egypt, but also it involves the companies that they are the project owners. Yes, this is a subsea pipeline that will be connected from the floating production unit that will be developed on top of the well. And the product will be transported via this subsea pipeline to port side, and from port side will be diverted either to the domestic market or to a liquefaction plant.
لكن متى يبدأ الإنتاج من حقل أفروديت؟
Not yet. This is something that was concluded only a few weeks back. There was an approval provided to the project owners by the Republic of Cyprus that we agreed on the development and production plan. So now there are certain milestones that they will have to be delivered. The first one is in 9 months. And there are other 2 milestones in order to get this discovery into production.
بهذا مشاهدينا نصل إلى ختام حلقة هذا الأسبوع مستقبل الطاقة. للمزيد دائما تابعونا على منصة أكس تحت وسم #مستقبل الطاقة. يمكنكم مشاهدة حلقات البرنامج كاملة على موقعنا الإلكتروني العربية.net/programs، وأيضا على قناتنا على اليوتيوب. نلقاكم في نفس الموعد الأسبوع المقبل. إلى اللقاء.